Imagine a child of just 12 years old. Curious, intelligent, passionate about engineering, and driven by an unusual desire to understand how things work. Now imagine that same child not just dreaming of the impossible, but achieving it. Creating, with your own hands, a functional electric car. It wasn't a toy, it wasn't a school experiment. It was a real vehicle, small, practical, efficient. A project that could have completely changed the way we think about urban transport, accessibility, and sustainability. But this invention was banned. Not because it is unstable, nor because it poses risks. On the contrary, it was too simple, too economical, too functional. And that's exactly what made it a problem. The idea of a boy creating something that went against the interests of billion-dollar companies was, for many people, unacceptable. The story you are about to hear now sounds like science fiction, or perhaps a movie script. But it happened, in truth, and it was buried as quickly as it appeared. Few knew, even fewer remember. But the records exist, and when we put all the pieces in place, what we see is not just an inspiring story. It's a silent indictment of how genius can be stifled, not by lack of resources but by too much threat. Why would anyone ban such a promising project created by a child? Why did a clean and cheap electrical invention never reach the market? And, above all, who benefits when ideas like these disappear? This is the story of a young genius who dared to create something too great for the world to accept. A boy who believed that mobility could be simple, accessible, and free from fossil fuels. And when he got too close to the answer, he was silenced. The question that remains is not only what happened to him, but how many others like him existed, and were erased from history before their names were remembered. Get ready to discover a real, forgotten, and uncomfortable story. A story that perhaps explains why the world still insists on selling the future as something distant, when, in fact, it has already knocked on our door. They just didn't want to open it. If you believe some truths are too uncomfortable to tell, keep watching, because this story will make you question much more than just an electric car created by a child. It will make you think about the kind of world we live in, and who really decides what can and cannot be put on the streets. If this type of story awakens the same curiosity in you that it awakened in me, take the opportunity now to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps a lot to move these stories forward, especially the ones that almost no one wants to tell, because what comes next is even more revealing. His name was Elijah, an ordinary boy from a small town in the interior of the United States where nothing big used to happen. He was 12 years old, lived with his parents in a modest house, and spent most of his time in the backyard, taking apart old objects, building improvised mechanisms, and drawing electrical diagrams on used notebook paper. He didn't come from a rich family, not even from a lineage of scientists. What he had was curiosity, many, and a kind of look that seemed to see possibilities where others only saw junk. At the age of 5, Elijah took apart the fan in the living room just to understand how it worked. At 7, he fixed his neighbor's toaster using parts from a broken toy. And at 9, he began experimenting with electric motors, repurposed from toys, old radios, and even discarded tools. It didn't take long for him to start dreaming bigger. During a school science fair, he presented an electric motor project using recycled parts that, to everyone's astonishment, actually worked. The small engine turned smoothly, powered by a makeshift source of flashlight batteries. It was simple, but it was functional, and mostly it was something he had done alone. It was at that moment that the idea for something bigger was born. Elijah spent the next few years studying everything he could. There was no fast internet, no sophisticated laboratories, but he had access to the school library, where he delved into old books about electrical engineering, automobiles, and 19th century inventors. Nikola Tesla became his hero, Charles Steinmetz his inspiration. He read about magnetic fields, induction, coils, and alternating current with the same enthusiasm that other children had when watching cartoons. He said that if they could do the impossible 100 years ago, so could he. At 11, he began designing what he called a car for everyone. A small, light electric vehicle powered by a system of recyclable engines and an alternative energy source based on induction, which he himself began to develop with reused plates and wires. In a few months, with the help of a toy car and some adaptations, he created a functional, small-scale prototype. The cart moved not with ordinary batteries, but with a homemade proximity induction system. A feeder plate was on the floor, and when the prototype approached it, it began to move. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't stable, but it was real. The idea was to transform this concept into a larger vehicle. And with the help of a mechanic neighbor, Elijah began adapting an abandoned go-kart chassis. For months, he worked hidden in the backyard. I soldered, tested, made mistakes, started over. And upon turning 12, he did what many would consider impossible. He started the vehicle, and it drove. Quiet, clean, stable. Driven by a principle that continues to be explored by large automakers to this day: electromagnetic induction. The news spread quickly. First, it was the neighbors. Then, a small local newspaper did an article about the boy who built an electric car in his backyard. And that's when everything started to change. The video of the demonstration went viral, and along with the positive attention came worried looks. People with ties, strange emails, meeting invitations. Companies that, instead of congratulating, began to probe. Some wanted to buy the idea. Others wanted to collaborate. But deep down, they all wanted one thing: control. Elijah's parents, simple and inexperienced with this type of approach, began to become fearful. The proposals sounded too generous, but the contracts came with strange clauses. In one of them, it was required that the prototype be delivered in full and exclusively to the interested company, which was not committed to producing, only to evaluating. In another, a symbolic amount was offered in exchange for the transfer of the intellectual property of the idea. In just a few days, the story went from being about a genius boy to being about an invention that could be going too far. The following week, a local regulatory body came forward with a notice. He claimed that Elijah's project violated safety standards because it had not undergone official testing. He was banned from making further public demonstrations. Videos that were on the internet began to be taken down. The local newspaper article disappeared from the website, and silence took over what, until recently, seemed to be a revolution in progress. At age 12, Elijah knew the weight of being too bothersome. What is most impressive about this story is not just the boy's technical ability, but the fact that with almost non-existent resources, he had the audacity to question a consolidated industrial model. He created something that worked, was affordable, and didn't rely on gas, oil, or heavy batteries. A vehicle that could, yes, have been refined, perfected, put into small-scale production, but never had the chance. Your mistake? It worked. In the eyes of those who profit from the current model, the idea of a simple functional technology created by someone outside the system was a risk, and risks like this are not tolerated. Elijah, after that, moved on with his life. Today, he is a young adult who still works with technology but avoids interviews. He says he learned too early that not all inventions are welcome, and sometimes the world is not ready for those who think differently. But what he left behind, even if for a short time, was concrete proof that it is possible to do a lot with little, that good ideas don't need to come from million-dollar laboratories, and that genius can be born in the most unlikely places. If this story seems absurd to you, wait until you hear what came next, because Elijah wasn't the only one. And the next case involves one of the largest automakers in the world, and even more brazen sabotage. The project was working. The wheels turned. The car moved. The idea of Elijah, a boy of just 12 years old, was no longer a dream. It was a fact. A lightweight, functional, induction-powered electric vehicle built from recycled parts and driven by pure scientific curiosity. And that's exactly where the problem started. At first, what he received were compliments. The local community was delighted. The video of the demonstration went viral on social media, and for a few days, Elijah became a symbol of spontaneous innovation. Reporters from technology websites were looking for his parents. Educators shared his story as inspiration. The world seemed ready to embrace a new genius. But it didn't take long for the attention to turn into vigilance. The first sign came in the form of silence. Some reports mysteriously disappeared from the air. Websites that had published articles about Elijah simply deleted the content without explanation. The links broke. The images disappeared. Then came the strange contacts. People calling the family home, introducing themselves as representatives of companies interested in helping. Some proposed partnerships, but with vague clauses. Others offered to buy the project for symbolic amounts, on the condition that everything was kept confidential. One of the most curious documents was hand-delivered by a man who claimed to represent a National Technical Association. He suggested that the technology Elijah created was too delicate to be exploited outside of regulated environments, and that, therefore, should be immediately discontinued and subjected to restricted analysis. The tone was cordial, but the content made it clear. Either they delivered the project, or they would face consequences. The situation escalated when the family tried to register the patent. The request was refused. The EU justification was incoherent, lack of technical novelty, and risk of public instability due to improper use. The official response treated Elijah's invention as something incompatible with market standards, even without in-depth analysis. It was as if the system said, "This cannot exist." Days later, while walking home from school, Elijah was approached by an unknown man. Disguised, generic-looking, common clothes. Nothing caught his attention except what he said. "You moved where you shouldn't have." It was just those words. There was no scream. There was no direct threat. But the phrase stuck in the boy's mind, and in the fear on his parents' faces. They decided to stop, for safety, by instinct. They kept the prototype. They dismantled part of the circuit, and they promised not to speak publicly about the project anymore. What would be a revolution became a memory of forced silence. The school removed the project from the science fair mural. Management recommended that the family no longer get involved with sensitive technical matters, and colleagues who previously admired him began to avoid talking about the subject. It was as if something invisible had contaminated everything around the idea. What most revolts in this story is not just the imposed fear. It's the subtle, but systematic, way in which everything was discouraged. There was no confiscation. There was no police chase. Just the use of bureaucratic mechanisms, veiled messages, and strategic omissions. The kind of oppression that leaves no evidence but produces silence. Why so much effort to erase an idea? Because ideas like this pose real danger to established business models. Elijah's car was too simple. It did not require an expensive production chain. It did not depend on fossil fuels. It did not use expensive lithium batteries or difficult-to-access imported components. It could, with adaptation, be produced artisanally by communities, technical schools, small innovation, groups, and that was unacceptable. For those who profit from technological dependence, a cheap and accessible solution is not progress, it's a threat. There is no point in developing something that allows energy independence. It is in the interest of keeping the consumer stuck in the cycle of consumption and maintenance. Modern electric vehicles are still hostage to long recharges, expensive stations, and batteries with a limited lifespan. What Elijah proposed was a rupture, and ruptures, historically, have always been frowned upon by those who profit from stability. The scariest thing is to think that his story may not be an isolated case. How many other inventions, ideas, or solutions were buried before they were born? How many were suffocated before making headlines? And how many inventors like Elijah were convinced or coerced to stop before they became too annoying? The phrase, "you moved where you shouldn't have," sums it up. It reveals the invisible line between acceptable innovation and dangerous innovation. Not dangerous because it is unstable, but dangerous because it works too well, because it represents a future that cannot be controlled by those who control the present today. Elijah's project was stopped before it could be refined. He never had the chance to test it on public roads, to seek ethical partners, or to see his invention take on the world. All of this was prevented by pressures that came not from laboratories, nor from fair competitors, but from a system that does not tolerate exceptions. And perhaps this is the greatest injustice of all, because by silencing a 12-year-old boy, what was silenced was not just an idea. It was the hope that real innovation can come from anywhere. It was a reminder that not all progress comes from big corporations, and that transformation is often born in backyards, in improvised workshops, in minds that have not yet learned to obey. Elijah's case should have been widely studied. It should have inspired public policies, educational programs, movements to encourage children's and youth's creativity. But instead, he was hushed up, made invisible, treated as a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was a threat to the system, and therefore needed to be stopped. Now that you know this part of the story, you may begin to understand why so many promising technologies never get off the ground. It's not for lack of capacity. It's because excess control. And when ideas become dangerous to those in power, they are silenced. But only for a while, because some ideas are too good to disappear forever. Elijah's prototype wasn't just an impressive technical feat coming from a 12-year-old boy. It represented a complete paradigm shift. While automakers at the time tested electric vehicles with limited range, long recharge times, and high operating costs, the car Elijah developed presented something rare: functional simplicity. It used an electromagnetic induction system to generate movement in real time, without relying on expensive lithium batteries or constant recharging. Its energy consumption was minimal. The efficiency is surprising, and the cost almost zero. With adjustments and investment, that project could have given rise to something much bigger: a fleet of sustainable, affordable, simple-to-maintain urban microvehicles that are completely independent of fossil fuels or complex charging networks. A model that would not only question traditional transportation, but it would threaten the foundation of everything that sustains the modern automotive industry. Let's imagine, for a moment, that this had happened. Instead of waiting a century for the first commercial electric vehicles to become popular, the transformation could have started decades earlier. Cities could have been redesigned for compact, lightweight, quiet vehicles. Urban pollution would have decreased drastically. Oil consumption would have been slowed down. Millions of people in different parts of the world would have access to functional vehicles for a fraction of the current price. Transport would no longer be a privilege linked to large automakers and would become part of a decentralized urban mobility movement. Local workshops could adapt cars with similar technology. Technical schools could train young innovators like Elijah to work with sustainable systems. And governments could have invested in smarter infrastructure based on clean electricity and community microgeneration. But none of that happened. Why? Why it worked too well. The industry's logic is not to deliver the best possible product. It means delivering a product that generates dependency, maintenance, spare parts, and, most importantly, constant profit. A car that practically consumes nothing, that can be maintained with simple tools, and that doesn't require constant recharging. It's everything this industry has learned to avoid. Elijah didn't just invent a car, he invented a threat, a real risk of technological decentralization, of energetic freedom, of independence. Now imagine the environmental impact of this. If a fleet of vehicles like Elijah's had been developed and adapted on a large scale, The current scenario could be radically different. Large cities would not be hostage to pollution from combustion engines. Air quality would have improved. The impact of transportation on global warming would have been drastically reduced. And it doesn't stop there. With practically zero operating costs, these vehicles could have democratized access to mobility in low-income countries, in remote regions, in peripheral communities. They could have brought autonomy to places where public transport never reached efficiently. This type of revolution, however, is of no interest to those who control capital flows. An idea that eliminates the need for fuel, a network of stations, expensive batteries, large dealerships. It's not a good idea for the market, but it is an extraordinary idea for the world. The most surprising thing is that Elijah didn't even understand the extent of what he had done. For him, it was just a garage project, an experiment by those who wanted to make the world move without depending on fuel. His motivation was never to challenge big companies or attack the system. He just wanted to create something functional, something simple, something that made sense. And that was precisely what made his invention so powerful. Because when a solution comes from someone who doesn't want to gain power but to solve a real problem, it becomes genuinely transformative. But instead of recognition, what Elijah received was silence. Instead of support, pressure. Instead of encouragement, censorship. The phrase he heard, "You messed up where you shouldn't have," didn't concern safety or regulation. It concerned territory. He unintentionally invaded the corporate space. It touched on a sensitive point, the fear that someone outside the system will be able to do better. The big twist in this story is not just the early discovery of a genius boy. It's in the impact that it would have been generated if his idea had been accepted, developed, and expanded. Elijah had, in essence, a model for the future. A future that could have arrived before its time. A lighter, cleaner, fairer future. But because it was too good, it was blocked, shelved, forgotten. And this leads us to an uncomfortable reflection. How many other futures have already been canceled before they even happened? How many Elijahs were there in different parts of the world with ideas as powerful as they were dangerous for the system? How many affordable and efficient technologies have been rejected because they were not profitable enough? Elijah's revolution wasn't just in the engine. It was in the logic behind it. A vehicle that doesn't tie anyone to plugs, oil, expensive batteries, or maintenance plans. A vehicle that liberates. And freedom, as we already know, tends to bother more than any invention. Still, his story was not in vain. Because even though it has been erased from the surface, it resists, like a seed that remained in the ground, waiting for the right moment to sprout. And perhaps now, with the world increasingly open to sustainable and decentralized solutions, it is time to look back and rescue what was buried before its time. After all, sometimes what we call innovation today is just memory being rediscovered. What does this story say about the world we live in? It reveals an uncomfortable truth. Brilliant ideas don't disappear because they're bad. They disappear because they threaten someone, because they bother those who profit from what is already established, because they suggest that the future could be more accessible, fairer, simpler, and this is dangerous for whoever controls the complex. Elijah wasn't the first, and it certainly won't be the last. How many other inventions like his have been buried before they were even born? How many sustainable, cheap, functional projects were locked in drawers, filed under layers of bureaucracy, or purchased only to never be used? The truth is that we live in a system where innovation does not just depend on genius. It depends on permission, of acceptance. And when an idea crosses the line of what is permitted, it is deleted, silently, as if it had never existed. Elijah's car had everything to work out, and precisely for that reason, couldn't move forward. But perhaps what's most impressive about this story isn't even the technology. It's the logic behind censorship. The way a clean, efficient, possible project was treated as a threat, not because it was flawed, but because it worked too much. And here's something even more disturbing. This practice doesn't just happen to anonymous inventors. There are records of large automakers that, over the decades, bought innovative projects with immense potential, only to bury them. Some of these companies invested millions in patents for sustainable technologies, they promised releases, made a fuss in the press, and then, simply, they never released anything. Coincidence or strategy? What if I told you that a multinational bought 42 patents for clean energy systems and locked them in a safe until today? In the next video, you will learn about this case. Let's investigate how this industry giant acquired revolutionary ideas with the potential to change the world and never let them get off the ground. You will see names, documents, and behind the scenes of a decision that prevented the advancement of technologies that could be on the streets now, transforming the planet. If you want to understand how progress is shaped or blocked by invisible decisions, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and don't miss the next episode, because the story they're trying to hide is just beginning to be told.